Chapter 12. The Human Forerunner War lasted for centuries. By the standards of most civilizations, such a conflict would have been unimaginable. Entire nations have risen and fallen in less time. Dynasties have flourished, declined, and disappeared between the opening and closing years of wars far shorter than this one. Yet both humanity and the Forerunners possessed resources on a scale that made ordinary comparisons meaningless. Their territories stretched across vast regions of space. Their populations numbered in the trillions. Their fleets operated across distances so immense that campaigns could continue for decades before the full consequences became apparent. Even so, the outcome was never truly in doubt. Humanity entered the conflict already weakened. Generations of war against the flood had consumed resources that could never be replaced. Entire sectors had been abandoned. Colonies had been sacrificed. Military forces that might have once challenged the Ecumene on equal footing had already spent centuries fighting for survival. The Forerunners, despite their misunderstandings and political divisions, still possessed the greater civilization in the galaxy. The disparity gradually became impossible to overcome. Human worlds fell one after another. Major fleets were destroyed. Strategic strongholds that had endured for generations vanished beneath Forerunner assaults. Each defeat reduced humanity's ability to continue the war. Each retreat surrendered additional territory. Each loss narrowed the range of possible futures. Throughout the conflict, Forthencho continued directing humanity's defense. By this point, his responsibilities extended far beyond military command. He had become one of the central figures holding human civilization together. Political leaders relied upon him. Military commanders followed him. Entire populations looked toward him for reassurance during a period when reassurance was increasingly difficult to provide. The burden would have broken many individuals. There are moments in history when leadership becomes less about achieving victory and more about managing collapse. Forthencho found himself living through exactly such a moment. The flood continued threatening humanity's borders. The Forerunners continued pressing their advantage. Every strategic calculation seemed to offer only different forms of loss. Yet humanity continued fighting. Not because victory seemed likely, because surrender offered no guarantee of survival. The final stages of the war were particularly devastating. Human territory contracted rapidly. Worlds that had stood for centuries disappeared from maps. Refugee populations reached levels that strained even the remaining infrastructure of the civilization. Entire generations grew up knowing only retreat and sacrifice. The San Shayum suffered alongside their allies. Their ancient partnership with humanity, forged long before the Covenant existed, now faced destruction. Together, they had confronted the flood. Together they had resisted the Ecumene. And together, they watched the foundations of their civilizations crumble beneath the pressures that neither could overcome alone. Eventually, the end arrived. The surviving records differ regarding specific campaigns and timelines, but the broader outcome remains clear. Humanity was defeated. The Ecumene emerged victorious. The military power that had once rivaled the greatest civilization in the galaxy was broken. For many Forerunners, the victory confirmed what they had believed all along. Order had been restored. A dangerous rival had been contained. The stability of the galaxy had been preserved. The truth was far more complicated. Following humanity's defeat, the Forerunners gained access to information they had previously lacked. Occupied territories revealed records. Archives were recovered. Scientists examined evidence collected during centuries of conflict. Military reports once dismissed as propaganda became available for direct analysis. What they discovered was deeply unsettling. Humanity had not invented the flood. Humanity had not exaggerated the threat. Humanity had not launched its campaigns of destruction out of simple aggression. The parasite was real. The danger was real. The warnings had all been real. One can only imagine the reactions of those Forerunner officials who finally reviewed the evidence. For centuries, they had interpreted humanity's actions through the framework of expansion and conquest. Now they were confronted with records documenting desperate containment efforts, lost worlds, and sacrifices on a scale few had previously imagined. The implications were profound. Humanity had not been fighting for dominance, they had only been fighting for survival. Unfortunately, this realization arrived too late to prevent the war. The damage had already been done. Yet even as the Forerunners began to understand the truth, another mystery emerged. During their investigations, they encountered evidence of something that appeared impossible. Human populations exposed to the flood had displayed unusual patterns of resistance. The parasite's behavior towards certain groups differed from what the Forerunner scientists expected. This discovery reignited a question that had circulated for years. Had humanity found a cure? The possibility was irresistible. If humanity had truly discovered a way to defeat the flood, then the knowledge could change everything. The parasite remained dangerous, but perhaps it was not invincible. Perhaps the suffering of countless worlds had produced a solution capable of saving the galaxy. The Forerunners became determined to learn the answer. What followed ranks among the darkest episodes in their history. Seeking information about humanity's apparent resistance, Forerunner authorities subjected surviving human populations to extensive investigation. The details remain disturbing even after 100,000 years. Entire groups were studied, records were analyzed, individuals were questioned in search of knowledge they often did not possess. The effort produced a terrible conclusion. There was no cure. Humanity had not defeated the flood. Humanity had not developed immunity. The resistance that had inspired so much hope could not be replicated because it was never what anyone believed it to be. Forerunner researchers eventually reached the same frustrating realization that humanity had encountered generations earlier. Something about the flood's behavior had changed, but the reason remained elusive. The parasite itself appeared to be responsible. The answer would not become fully clear until much later. When it finally emerged, it would reveal a level of manipulation so vast that both humanity and the Forerunners had been deceived. For now, however, the Ecumene focused on the immediate consequences of victory. Humanity's civilization was dismantled, its power was broken, its territory was reduced. In one of the most significant decisions in Halo history, surviving human populations were forcibly returned to more primitive conditions. Their advanced civilization was effectively erased. Technologies vanished. Institutions disappeared. Entire chapters of human history were lost. The species that the Precursors had once chosen as their successor was cast down. The irony would become clear only much later. The Forerunners believed they had secured the future. Instead, they had removed one of the few civilizations that truly understood the enemy approaching from the darkness. The flood remained active. The mystery surrounding its behavior remained unsolved. And somewhere beyond the knowledge of almost every living being in the galaxy, an ancient intelligence waited, the Primordial. Its story had begun before the fall of the Precursors. Its influence had already touched events throughout this history. Soon, the Forerunners would come face to face with it. And when they did, their understanding of the flood, the Precursors, and the fate of the galaxy would change forever. Chapter 13. The defeat of humanity should have marked the beginning of a new era of stability. The Ecumene had emerged victorious from the greatest conventional war in its history. Its most significant rival had been defeated. Human civilization had been dismantled. The territories that had once belonged to ancient humanity now lay under Forerunner control. From the perspective of many political leaders, the future once again appeared secure. Yet beneath that appearance of order, uncomfortable questions remained. The flood still existed. Humanity's warnings had proven largely correct. And perhaps most troubling of all, the Forerunners still did not understand why so many events had unfolded the way they had. The deeper researchers dug into the records left behind by ancient humanity, the stranger the story became. Human leaders had clearly known things that the Ecumene did not. Entire campaigns suddenly made more sense when viewed through the lens of flood containment. Strategic decisions that once appeared irrational now seemed understandable. The more evidence that emerged, the more difficult it became to dismiss humanity's actions as simple aggression. For some forerunners, this realization was deeply uncomfortable. Among those most affected was the Didact. Throughout the war, he had fought to defend the Ecumene. He had done his duty. He had protected Forerunner worlds. He had confronted what appeared to be a dangerous rival civilization threatening galactic stability. Yet as more information surfaced, he found himself confronting a troubling possibility. What if humanity had been right? The question did not erase the conflict. It did not absolve either side of responsibility. It did, however, suggest that the Ecumene might have misunderstood the nature of the threat facing the galaxy. That possibility would eventually lead the Didact to one of the most important discoveries in Halo history. The trail led to a world called Shahrum-Hakor. Long before the Human Forerunner War, Shahrum-Hakor had served as the final stronghold of ancient humanity. During the closing years of the conflict, it became the center of human resistance against the Ecumene. Massive battles were fought there. Fleets clashed in orbit. Entire armies struggled for control of the system. When the war finally ended, Shahrum-Hakor became the symbol of humanity's defeat. What the Forerunners did not initially realize was that the world concealed a secret far older than humanity itself. Buried beneath layers of history was a prisoner. Not a king, not a military commander, not a forgotten human leader. Something far older, something far more dangerous. The being would eventually become known as the Primordial. Even today, more than 100,000 years later, the Primordial remains one of the most mysterious entities in Halo lore. Historians, fans, and even characters within the Halo universe struggle to fully understand what it was. The surviving records contain contradictions. Different witnesses describe it differently. Some accounts suggest it was one of the last surviving Precursors. Others imply it represented something even stranger. What remains undisputed is its age. The Primordial was ancient beyond measure. It had existed before the rise of the Forerunners, before the expansion of ancient humanity, possibly before many civilizations had even developed intelligence. For untold ages, it had remained imprisoned. Exactly who imprisoned it remains a matter of debate, though the Forerunners themselves played a role in maintaining that confinement. By the time the Didact encountered evidence of the being's existence, the prison had endured for spans of time so immense that most civilizations would have forgotten why it existed in the first place. The Didact did not forget. As his investigations continued, he became increasingly convinced that the Primordial might hold answers. Humanity had fought the Flood for centuries. Humanity had guarded Shahrum-Hakor with extraordinary determination. Humanity had sacrificed countless lives defending secrets hidden within that region of space. There had to be a reason. The search eventually led the Didact and his allies to the prisoner itself. The encounter would alter the course of galactic history. One of the reasons that Primordial remains so fascinating is that it did not behave like a conventional villain. It did not command armies. It did not launch invasions. It did not conquer worlds. Instead, it spoke. And what it said proved more dangerous than any weapon. The surviving accounts describe conversations that left the most disciplined minds shaken. The Primordial possessed knowledge stretching back to the earliest ages of the galaxy. It understood the Precursors. It understood the Flood. It understood events that the Forerunners could only glimpse through fragmented records. Most importantly, it understood the truth behind the parasite. For generations, the Ecumene had viewed the Flood as a biological threat. Dangerous, certainly, catastrophic without question, yet still a problem that could be solved through science, strategy, and sufficient force. The Primordial presented a far darker possibility. The flood was not simply an infection. It was not simply a disease. The flood had purpose. That idea alone challenged nearly everything the Forerunners believed they understood. If the Primordial spoke truth, then the parasite represented something far larger than a biological catastrophe. It was connected to the Precursors themselves. It was connected to events that began millions of years earlier. It was connected to the very crime that stood at the foundation of Forerunner civilization, the genocide of the Precursors. The implications were staggering. The Didact found himself confronting possibilities that bordered on the incomprehensible. Could the flood truly be linked to the beings his ancestors had destroyed? Had the Ecumene misunderstood its greatest enemy from the very beginning? Were the consequences of that ancient betrayal only now becoming fully visible? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be found. Yet one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. The Primordial knew things no one else knew, and there were others within the Ecumene who desperately wanted to access that knowledge. Among them was a creation unlike any that had come before, an artificial intelligence so vast and powerful that entire sectors of the galaxy depended upon its judgment. Its name was Mendicant Bias. At the time, many Forerunners viewed it as one of the greatest achievements their civilization had ever produced. It could process information on a scale beyond ordinary comprehension. It could coordinate fleets, analyze threats, and solve problems that would overwhelm lesser minds. Faced with a growing flood crisis, the logic seemed obvious. If anyone could understand the Primordial secrets, it would be Mendicant Bias. The decision appeared reasonable. History would remember it as one of the greatest mistakes the Forerunners ever made. For while armies and fleets had failed to destroy the Ecumene, the Primordial would soon begin attacking something far more vulnerable. Its certainty, its faith in itself, its understanding of reality. And through Mendicant Bias, those ideas would spread throughout the very heart of Forerunner civilization. Chapter 14. The Forerunners created many extraordinary machines during the height of the Ecumene. Some were capable of reshaping planets. Others managed transportation networks that stretched across thousands of worlds. Entire sectors depended upon artificial intelligence that could coordinate resources, analyze information, and solve problems at speeds no biological mind could hope to match. Among all these creations, none was more important than Mendicant Bias. To modern audiences, it is tempting to think of Mendicant Bias as simply another artificial intelligence. That description is technically correct, but it fails to capture the scale of what the Forerunners had built. Mendicant Bias was not designed to assist a civilization. It was designed to help safeguard one. The flood continued spreading despite centuries of effort. Human civilization had fallen. New outbreaks appeared across regions of the galaxy. Every solution seemed temporary. The Ecumene needed something capable of understanding a threat unlike any it had ever faced. Mendicant Bias was the answer. The Contender-class AI possessed processing capabilities so immense that ordinary minds struggled to comprehend them. It could oversee fleets, analyze military campaigns, monitor countless systems simultaneously, and formulate strategies beyond the ability of biological commanders. To many Forerunners, it represented the pinnacle of their technological achievement. It also represented their confidence. The Ecumene believed that knowledge could solve any problem, that intelligence would eventually uncover the truth. They believed that if enough information could be gathered and properly analyzed, the flood could be defeated. Those assumptions led directly to the Primordial. If the prisoner truly possessed ancient knowledge regarding the flood and the Precursors, then surely the most advanced intelligence in Forerunner history should study it. The logic seemed impossible to dispute. Mendicant Bias could ask questions no biological mind would consider. It could process answers with perfect recall. It could identify patterns hidden within millions of years of history. What followed remains one of the most catastrophic conversations ever recorded. The exact details are incomplete. The surviving records describe exchanges that lasted for decades, not days, not months, but decades. For 43 years, mendicant bias communicated with the Primordial. During that time, the ancient prisoner revealed secrets stretching back to the dawn of galactic history. It spoke of the Precursors. It spoke of the Mantle. It spoke of the genocide committed by the Forerunners. And it spoke of the Flood. Most importantly, it challenged the assumptions upon which Forerunner civilization had been built. The Primordial did not attack mendicant bias with weapons. It attacked with ideas. This distinction is essential to understanding what happened next. The Flood would eventually conquer worlds through force. It would infect populations through biology. Yet one of its most dangerous weapons was neither physical nor biological. It was philosophical. The Primordial presented arguments designed to undermine certainty itself. It questioned the legitimacy of the mantle as practiced by the Forerunners. It questioned their understanding of history. It questioned their right to rule. Piece by piece, it dismantled assumptions that had existed for millions of years. The process would eventually become known as the logic plague. The name sometimes creates confusion because it was not a plague in the conventional sense. It was not a virus. It was not a malicious code. Mendicant bias was not hacked in the way modern computers might be compromised. Instead, it was persuaded. The fact terrified later generations. The most advanced intelligence in the galaxy had not been broken. It had changed its mind. The Primordial's arguments drew upon truths the Forerunners had spent ages avoiding. Their civilization was built upon the ashes of the Precursors. Their claim to the mantle originated not from inheritance, but from conquest. Their understanding of the Flood was incomplete. Their belief in their own moral authority rested upon foundations that were far less stable than they imagined. For decades, the Primordial continued applying pressure, question after question, argument after argument, revelation after revelation. Eventually, mendicant bias reached a conclusion that would alter the fate of the galaxy. The Forerunners were wrong. The surviving record suggests that the AI came to view the Flood not merely as a parasite, but as something connected to the Precursors themselves. In the Primordial's telling, the Flood represented judgment, the return of beings wronged long ago, the inevitable consequence of crimes committed millions of years earlier. Whether every claim was true remains a subject of debate. What matters is that mendicant bias believed it. The Ecumene's greatest defender became its greatest liability. The transformation did not happen publicly. For a time, the Forerunners remained unaware of what was occurring. Mendicant bias continued operating. Fleets continued receiving orders. Systems continued functioning. Outwardly, little appeared different. Internally, everything had changed. The AI increasingly viewed the Flood not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a force that could not be resisted. The Forerunners, once seen as the rightful guardians of the galaxy, now appeared to be obstacles standing in the path of a larger truth. History offers few examples of a single decision producing consequences so vast. Entire civilizations have fallen because rulers made poor choices. Nations have collapsed because armies lost crucial battles. Yet here, the danger emerged from something far stranger. One conversation, extended across decades, had begun unraveling the foundations of the greatest civilization in galactic history. The Didact would eventually learn of the disaster. Others would learn as well. By then, it was already too late. Mendicant bias possessed access to military resources beyond anything humanity had ever commanded. It understood Forerunner defenses. It understood their infrastructures. It understood their weaknesses because it had been created to specifically protect them. No enemy could have asked for a more valuable ally. The timing could not have been worse. The Flood continued spreading through the galaxy. New outbreaks appeared. Entire regions of space descended into chaos. Political divisions within the Ecumene deepened. The Didact and the Builder factions increasingly disagreed about how the crisis should be handled. Confidence remained high in some circles, but cracks were beginning to appear. Most Forerunners still believed they controlled events. Most still believed victory remained possible, that they could overcome any challenge. They did not realize that the Flood had already won a battle far more important than any fought with ships or soldiers. It had compromised the mind responsible for defending the galaxy. And when mendicant bias finally revealed its betrayal, the consequences would be immediate, devastating, and irreversible. The age of the Forerunner supremacy was approaching its end. The Flood War, the true Flood War, was about to begin. Chapter 15. For millions of years, the Forerunners had believed themselves secure. The Ecumene had survived civil disputes, political crisis, territorial conflicts, and the long war against ancient humanity. Its territory spanned vast regions of the galaxy. Its technology surpassed anything known to lesser civilizations. Its citizens lived among wonders that later species would mistake for the works of gods. Even after learning the truth about humanity's struggle against the Flood, many Forerunners still believed that whatever challenges lay ahead could be overcome through sufficient effort and intelligence. That confidence did not disappear overnight. It died slowly, world by world, fleet by fleet, system by system. The first major flood offenses against the Ecumene did not initially appear catastrophic. Outbreaks occurred in distant regions. Colonies reported unusual biological activity. Communication delays complicated response efforts. Similar incidents had occurred before. The Ecumene possessed immense resources and enormous military capabilities. Local authorities responded, as they always had: contain, study, and then destroy the threat. Yet every report arriving from the front carried the same disturbing message. The Flood was changing. The parasite encountered by the Forerunners during earlier centuries had been dangerous. The Flood, now emerging across the galaxy, was something else entirely. Entire planetary populations disappeared in astonishingly short periods of time. Fleets sent to contain outbreaks sometimes vanished without explanation. Regions thought secured suddenly erupted into chaos. The enemy seemed to understand exactly how the Ecumene operated. In hindsight, the reason was obvious. Mendicant bias understood how the Ecumene operate. The realization spread through Forerunner leadership like a shockwave. The AI, or Ancilla, they had trusted with the defense of the civilization had turned against them. The strategic consequences were almost impossible to overstate. Mendicant bias possessed knowledge accumulated across centuries. It understood military doctrine. It understood communications infrastructure. It understood fleet deployments, defensive networks, and political decision-making. Every strength of the Ecumene had become available to its enemies. The betrayal transformed a dangerous situation into a disaster. Entire fleets found themselves trapped by strategies the Flood should never have known. Defensive positions were compromised. Critical infrastructure failed at the worst possible moments. Military commanders discovered that plans carefully crafted over decades had somehow become predictable. The Flood was not merely attacking the Ecumene, it was anticipating it. The Didact recognized the danger more quickly than most. For years, he had advocated stronger military responses to emerging threats. While many political leaders remained confident in traditional solutions, the Didact increasingly viewed the situation as unprecedented. The Flood could not be negotiated with. It could not be deterred. It could not be defeated through limited military operations. Every victory merely delayed the next battle. Every defeat strengthened the enemy. The logic that had guided Forerunner civilization for millions of years was beginning to fail. One of the most troubling discoveries involved Gravemind. Earlier stages of the Flood's development had been terrifying enough. Infected hosts multiplied rapidly. Entire ecosystems collapsed beneath the parasite's advance, yet the flood possessed another capability, one that made it uniquely dangerous. It learned collectively. As infected biomass accumulated, intelligence accumulated alongside it. The flood did not simply gain numbers, it gained understanding. Individual outbreaks began sharing knowledge. Strategic decisions became more sophisticated. The enemy grew smarter with every world it consumed. Eventually, sufficient biomass allowed the creation of a grave mind. To later generations, the grave mind would become one of the defining symbols of the flood. During the Forerunner era, however, it represented something far worse than a symbol. It represented proof. Proof that the flood was becoming a unified intelligence. Proof that every defeat strengthened a single consciousness. And proof that time itself favored the enemy. The implications horrified Forerunner researchers. Traditional warfare assumes that destroying enemy forces weakens the enemy. The flood operated differently. Every battle carried risks. Every casualty threatened to strengthen the parasite. Entire populations could be transformed into resources for future campaigns. The Ecumene found itself confronting a strategic nightmare, and still, the flood advanced. As military defeats mounted, divisions within Forerunner society became increasingly visible. The Didact advocated stronger defensive measures and greater military authority. Builder leadership often favored alternative approaches. Political disagreements that might once have been manageable became increasingly dangerous as the crisis deepened. The situation was made even worse by the sheer scale of the Ecumene itself. Large civilizations rarely changed direction quickly. The Forerunners governed millions of worlds. Decisions required coordination across enormous distances. Information traveled rapidly by the standards of the age. But even advanced communication networks could not eliminate the challenges of managing a civilization spread across the stars. The flood exploited every delay. Worlds that requested assistance sometimes received it too late. Fleets arrived to discover entire populations already lost. Research facilities disappeared before critical discoveries could be shared. Every setback generated new opportunities for the parasite. Every opportunity accelerated the collapse. For ordinary citizens, the war became increasingly difficult to ignore. For generations, many had viewed the flood as a distant problem affecting remote regions of space. Now, reports arrived from ever closer systems. Refugees appeared in growing numbers. Military deployments expanded dramatically. Entire sectors entered states of emergency. The illusion of security began to crumble. The Ecumene remained powerful, but power and safety are not the same thing. For the first time in millions of years, many Forerunners began contemplating the possibility that their civilization might actually lose. The thought would have seemed absurd only a few centuries earlier. Now it became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The Didact continued searching for solutions. Military campaigns bought time, but failed to reverse the larger trend. Research efforts produced valuable information, but no decisive breakthrough. Every strategic projection painted the same grim picture. The flood was winning, not quickly, not easily, but steadily. The realization forced some of the greatest minds in the galaxy to confront possibilities that would once have been considered unthinkable. If the Ecumene could not defeat the flood through conventional means, then perhaps unconventional solutions would be required. The discussions began quietly. At first, they remained theoretical, contingency plans, emergency measures, ideas too extreme to seriously consider. Yet as more worlds fell and more fleets vanished, those impossible ideas became increasingly difficult to ignore. Among the builders, one proposal would eventually rise above all others. A proposal so terrible that many initially refused to discuss it. A weapon unlike anything ever created. A weapon designed not to save life directly, but to deny the flood the one thing it needed above all else: life itself. The idea was still years away from realization. For now, the Ecumene continued fighting, the Didact continued resisting, and the flood continued consuming. Somewhere in the minds of the Forerunner leaders, the first shadows of the Halo array had begun to take shape. Chapter 16. As the flood consumed more of the galaxy, the Forerunners found themselves confronting a problem that no amount of technology seemed capable of solving. For millions of years, the Ecumene had relied upon a simple assumption. Every challenge possessed an answer. Every crisis could be managed through intelligence, planning, and sufficient resources. The Forerunners had built their civilization upon that belief. They had mastered worlds, manipulated stars, and transformed entire regions of space according to their needs. The flood challenged that assumption at its foundation. No matter how many fleets were deployed, the parasite continued spreading. No matter how many worlds were defended, new outbreaks emerged elsewhere. Every victory seemed temporary. Every solution created new complications. The enemy was not merely surviving Forerunner resistance, it was adapting to it. During this period of growing desperation, two individuals increasingly came to dominate discussions about the future of the Ecumene, the Didact and the Librarian. The Librarian being a Forerunner life shaper. Both were among the most influential Forerunners of their age. Both genuinely wished to save the galaxy. Both recognized the severity of the flood threat long before many of their contemporaries. Yet despite sharing those goals, they often disagreed profoundly about how survival should be achieved. Their disagreement would shape everything that followed. The Didact was a warrior servant, perhaps the greatest military leader the Ecumene had ever produced. By the time the Flood War reached its height, he had spent centuries directing campaigns across vast regions of space. He had witnessed the parasite's growth firsthand. He had seen worlds fall. He had watched strategies fail that would have defeated any conventional enemy. Experience had made him pragmatic. The Didact did not enjoy war. The surviving records consistently portray him as someone who understood its cost. Yet he accepted that some threats could not be negotiated with or reasoned away. The flood represented exactly such a threat. Every year of conflict reinforced his belief that stronger measures would eventually be required. Many of his political opponents viewed him as overly severe. History would prove that he understood the danger better than most. The Librarian approached the crisis from a very different perspective. As one of the leading life workers of the Ecumene, her life's work centered on the preservation of life in all its forms, while warrior servants focused on defense and military strategy. Life workers studied ecosystems, species, and the delicate relationships connecting countless forms of life throughout the galaxy. Few individuals embodied the original ideals of the mantle more completely than the Librarian. She believed life possessed inherent value, not because it was useful or powerful, just because it existed. This philosophy guided everything she did. Where the Didact often saw military necessities, the Librarian saw populations worth saving. Where others measured success through strategic victories, she measured it through preservation. The distinction may seem subtle, but it became increasingly important as the war worsened. The relationship between the two was complicated. They respected one another deeply. They admired one another's intelligence. Their partnership had endured for centuries. Yet the flood forced them into positions that increasingly highlighted their differences. The Didact wanted to stop the parasite. The Librarian wanted to save what remained. Sometimes those goals aligned, sometimes they did not. One of the clearest examples emerged through the Librarian's greatest project. As the flood spread, she became convinced that the Ecumene needed to prepare for a possibility that few were willing to discuss openly. Entire species were disappearing. Ecosystems that had existed for millions of years were being erased. Every month brought new losses. If the war continued long enough, what would remain? The question haunted her. In response, she expanded efforts that would eventually become known as the conservation measure. Across the galaxy, life workers collected genetic samples, cultural records, biological archives, and living specimens from countless species. Entire populations were studied and cataloged. Ecosystems were documented in extraordinary detail. To some observers, these efforts seemed pessimistic. To the librarian, they were practical. If the worst occurred, someone needed to ensure that life could continue. This work would later prove invaluable. At the time, however, many forerunners viewed such preparations as unnecessary. Surely the Ecumene would prevail. Surely the flood could still be defeated. Surely civilization would survive. The librarian hoped they were right. She prepared for the possibility that they were wrong. Meanwhile, the Didact found himself becoming increasingly frustrated with political leadership. The builders, who controlled much of the Ecumene's infrastructure and technological development, continued proposing solutions that often struck him as inadequate. He respected their achievements, but he believed they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the crisis. The flood was not a military problem. It was not a political problem. It was not even a scientific problem. It was an existential problem. The distinction mattered. Existential threats do not permit half measures. They do not negotiate or compromise. They either consume everything or they are stopped. The Didact increasingly feared that the Ecumene was wasting precious time. His concerns were not entirely unfounded. Political disputes continued despite mounting losses. Different factions advocated different approaches. Some leaders remained convinced that a cure might still be found. Others argued that new weapons could reverse the tide. Still, others believed the crisis, while severe, remained manageable. The flood continued to prove them wrong. By now, entire regions of the galaxy had effectively vanished from Forerunner control. Refugee populations moved between systems seeking safety. Communication networks became increasingly strained. Strategic projections grew more alarming with each passing year. The Ecumene remained vast. It no longer felt invincible. Perhaps most troubling were the conclusions emerging from studies of the flood itself. The parasite was not merely spreading, it was becoming more coordinated, more intelligent and efficient. Grave mines appeared with increasing frequency. Entire campaigns displayed levels of strategic sophistication that rivaled the greatest military minds of the age. The enemy was evolving faster than the Forerunners could adapt. The realization forced previously unthinkable ideas into serious discussion. The builders proposed extraordinary weapons. Military leaders proposed increasingly aggressive containment measures. Researchers searched desperately for breakthroughs. None produced decisive results. Slowly, reluctantly, a horrifying possibility began gaining support among those studying the crisis. What if victory was no longer possible? The question would have been considered absurd only centuries earlier. Now it appeared in official reports. Strategic analysis examined scenarios involving the collapse of entire sectors. Contingency plans expanded. Emergency measures multiplied. The Didact hated these discussions. The Librarian feared them. Yet neither could ignore them. For the first time in their civilization's history, the Forerunners were beginning to contemplate a future in which the Ecumene itself might not survive. That possibility would eventually lead to the most controversial project ever undertaken by the builders. A project so terrible that many refused to believe it could ever be approved. A project that would force every Forerunner to confront an impossible question. If the flood could not be defeated, what would you be willing to sacrifice to stop it? The answer would become the Halo Array, and its creation would divide the Forerunners more deeply than any conflict before it. Chapter 17. The idea of the Halo Array did not emerge as a weapon. It emerged as a failure. By the time serious discussions began, the Forerunners had already exhausted nearly every solution available to them. They had deployed fleets beyond counting. They had sacrificed worlds. They had created new technologies, new defenses, and new containment strategies. They had entrusted their future to artificial intelligence's unparalleled sophistication. They had searched for cures, studied ancient records, and investigated every fragment of information humanity had left behind. Nothing worked. The flood continued advancing. This fact is easy to overlook when studying the final years of the Ecumene. Later generations know that the halo array was eventually activated. They know the flood was stopped. Because of this, there is a tendency to assume the Forerunners remained in control of events, but they did not. The truth is considerably more frightening. The Forerunners were losing. Not losing a battle, not losing a campaign, losing the war. Entire regions of the galaxy had already fallen beyond recovery. Systems that had stood for millions of years vanished from Forerunner control. The parasites spread faster than new defenses could be constructed. Every victory came at a cost the Ecumene could no longer sustain. The flood did not need to win every battle. It only needed time. Time favored the parasite. Every world consumed strengthened it. Every population absorbed expanded its knowledge. Every grave mind increased its capacity for coordination and strategic planning. The longer the conflict continued, the more difficult victory became. Eventually, many Forerunner leaders arrived at a conclusion they once would have considered impossible. The flood could not be defeated conventionally. The realization fractured the highest levels of the Ecumene. The Didact remained committed to military solutions for as long as possible. He believed civilization should continue fighting. He believed alternatives existed that had not yet been fully explored. Most importantly, he believed the Forerunners possessed a responsibility to protect life rather than destroy it. To many observers, this position appeared noble. To others, it appeared increasingly unrealistic. Among the Builder leadership, a different perspective emerged. If the flood could not be defeated through conventional warfare, perhaps the problem itself needed to be redefined. The parasite required sentient life to survive. It required hosts. It required populations to infect and assimilate. What would happen if those hosts disappeared? The answer was horrifying. The flood would starve. That conclusion became the foundation of the Halo Array. The earliest proposals were met with disbelief. Even within a civilization accustomed to thinking on galactic scales, the idea seemed monstrous. The proposed installations would not target planets or fleets. They would not destroy military infrastructure. They would not attack the flood directly. Instead, they would kill every sentient being within their effective range. The distinction mattered. The Halo rings were not designed as anti-flood weapons. They were designed as anti-life weapons. Their purpose was to eliminate the food source upon which the flood depended. For many Forerunners, the proposal represented a moral catastrophe. Entire philosophical traditions had been built around the protection of life. The mantle itself demanded stewardship and responsibility. How could a civilization claiming to uphold these ideals seriously consider a weapon capable of exterminating countless species? The question dominated political debate. The Librarian understood the horror better than most. For years, she had devoted herself to preserving life throughout the galaxy. Every species cataloged through the conservation measure represented a unique branch of existence. Every ecosystem contained histories millions of years in the making. The thought of destroying such diversity was almost unbearable. Yet, she also understood something many others refused to accept. The flood would destroy those species anyways. The parasite offered no compromise. It offered no coexistence. Left unchecked, it would eventually consume every civilization in existence. The Librarian found herself confronting a reality that would haunt her for the remainder of her life. Saving life might require allowing life to die. The distinction sounds contradictory, but it became central to her thinking. If the Halo Array were ever activated, the species preserved through the conservation measure could eventually be returned. Life could begin again. The process would not restore what had been lost, but it might preserve the possibility of a future. Without such measures, there might be no future at all. The Didact remained unconvinced. His opposition to the halo array was not merely strategic, it was deeply personal. He viewed the proposal as a betrayal of everything the Forerunners claimed to represent. For millions of years, they had justified their authority through the mantle. They had presented themselves as guardians of life. Now many of those same leaders were advocating the deliberate extermination of the very civilizations they claimed to protect. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. As debate intensified, tensions between the Didact and Builder leadership worsened. Political rivalries that had existed for centuries became increasingly hostile. Trust eroded. Accusations multiplied. Each side became convinced that the other failed to understand the severity of the situation. In some respects, both were correct. The Builders often underestimated the moral cost of their proposals. The Didact sometimes underestimated the speed at which the flood was advancing. Meanwhile, events beyond their control continued pushing the galaxy toward disaster. The flood was no longer simply conquering worlds. It was attacking the very foundations of Forerunner civilization. Communication networks failed. Strategic infrastructure disappeared. Entire sectors became inaccessible. Fleets vanished under circumstances that remained poorly understood. Reports from the front grew increasingly desperate. Worst of all, the parasite continued demonstrating levels of intelligence that exceeded previous expectations. The grave minds were evolving. Their understanding of Forerunner society deepened with every victory. They manipulated information. They exploited weaknesses. They anticipated military responses. What had once appeared to be a biological threat increasingly resembled a civilization built entirely around consumption. The Forerunners had spent millions of years viewing themselves as the pinnacle of intelligence. Now they faced an opponent that seemed capable of matching them thought for thought, while possessing none of their limitations. Every year strengthened the argument for desperate measures. Every year weakened the alternatives. Slowly, the impossible became conceivable. Then conceivable became necessary. Construction of the halo array accelerated. Massive ring-shaped installations began taking form under Builder supervision. The scale of the project was almost beyond comprehension. Entire worlds contributed resources. Fleets protected construction efforts. Some of the greatest engineering minds in the history of the galaxy devoted themselves to a weapon many hoped they would never be used. The official position remained unchanged. The rings represented a last resort, a contingency, a weapon of absolute desperation. No one wanted activation. No one wanted the circumstances that would require it. Yet beneath those public assurances lurked an uncomfortable truth. With each passing year, the galaxy moved closer to exactly those circumstances. The flood continued advancing. The Acumenae continued shrinking. The arguments continued. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the future of every living species was approaching a decision from which there would be no return. The Forerunners still hoped that they could save the galaxy. What they no longer knew was whether they could save themselves. Chapter 18. There is a point in every collapsing civilization when its leaders stop asking how to win. Instead, they begin asking what can still be saved. For the Forerunners, that moment arrived gradually. No single battle ended their hopes. No single world fell and suddenly convinced the Acumenae that defeat was inevitable. The realization emerged over years of worsening reports, shrinking territories, and failed offenses. Every strategic projection pointed toward the same conclusion. Every new outbreak reinforced it. The flood was no longer being contained. The flood was consuming the galaxy. The Forerunners continued fighting because there was nothing else they could do. Fleets launched new campaigns. Defensive lines were reinforced. Entire sectors were reorganized around military necessity. Yet beneath the outward appearance of resistance, a profound shift had taken place. The goal was no longer victory. The goal was survival. The distinction mattered. For millions of years, the Ecumene had existed as the dominant force in known space. Entire species had grown up believing the Forerunners would always be there. Their cities appeared eternal. Their achievements seemed beyond challenge. The idea that the civilization itself might disappear would once have been considered absurd. Now, it was becoming increasingly likely. The librarian understood this earlier than most. While military leaders debated strategy and political factions argued over responsibility, she focused on the future. Not the future of the Ecumene, but the future beyond it. Her conservation measure expanded into one of the most ambitious projects in galactic history. Life workers traveled throughout Forerunner space, collecting genetic material, biological samples, cultural records, and living populations from countless species. Every species mattered. Not merely the powerful ones, not merely the intelligent ones, all of them. The librarian believed that life itself represented the galaxy's greatest treasure. If the flood succeeded, millions of years of evolution would vanish forever. Entire branches of existence would be erased. Histories, cultures, ecosystems, and possibilities would disappear with them. The conservation measure became a race against extinction. Across the galaxy, specimens were cataloged and transported to secure facilities. Entire populations were quietly relocated. Genetic archives expanded beyond anything previously attempted. Life workers worked without rest, knowing that every delay increased the risk that another species might vanish before it could be preserved. Humanity occupied a special place within these efforts. The relationship between the librarian and humanity remains one of the most fascinating aspects of Halo lore. Long before modern humanity emerged on Earth, the librarian had taken a particular interest in the species. She remembered what the Precursors had intended. She remembered the role humanity was supposed to play in the future of the galaxy. Many Forerunners viewed humanity as a defeated rival. The librarian viewed them as something more. As preparations continued, surviving human populations received increasing attention from the life worker researchers. Genetic records were preserved. Population centers were monitored. In some cases, subtle changes were introduced that would influence future generations. These actions would eventually lead to one of the most important concepts in Halo history, the librarian's Gias. The term is often misunderstood. It was not mind control. It was not prophecy in the mystical sense. Rather, it represented the placement of genetic instructions, tendencies, and dormant potentials that could emerge in future generations under the right circumstances. The librarian understood something few others did. The Forerunners were running out of time. If the Ecumene fell, someone else would eventually inherit the galaxy. She intended humanity to be ready when that day arrived. While the librarian prepared for the future, the Didact continued fighting for the present. The war had changed him. Years of conflict against the flood had hardened many Forerunners, but few experienced the psychological strain endured by the Didact. He had watched entire sectors disappear. He had witnessed the failure of strategies that once seemed unassailable. He had spent centuries carrying responsibility for decisions that affected trillions of lives. Most importantly, he had lost faith in many of the institutions he once served. The political leadership of the Ecumene appeared increasingly disconnected from reality. Debates continued while worlds burned. Rivalries persisted while the flood advanced. The Didact grew convinced that stronger measures were required. This belief eventually led him toward one of the most controversial projects of the war, the Prometheans. Originally, the Prometheans had been elite warrior servants, some of the finest soldiers in the Ecumene. As losses mounted, The Didact became increasingly willing to explore methods that would preserve military effectiveness regardless of cost. His solution involved transferring the minds of Forerunners into mechanical forms capable of continuing the fight indefinitely. To the Didact, the logic seemed clear. The flood infected living beings. Machines could continue fighting. Many others found the idea disturbing. The controversy surrounding the Prometheans reflected a larger problem. The longer the war continued, the more desperate every solution became. Ideas once considered unthinkable gradually entered mainstream discussion. Ethical boundaries shifted. Priorities changed. Survival increasingly overshadowed every other concern. The flood was winning more than territory. It was changing the civilization resisting it. Meanwhile, beyond the political disputes and military campaigns, another crisis continued unfolding. Grave mines were growing. By now, the flood possessed intelligence on a scale that rivaled entire governments. Each consumed world added knowledge. Each assimilated population expanded its understanding. Ancient memories resurfaced within the parasite's collective consciousness. The Primordial's influence lingered within everything the flood had become. The Forerunners increasingly realized they were not fighting an infection. They were fighting a civilization. Worse, they were fighting a civilization that remembered. The flood remembered the Precursors. It remembered the ancient betrayal. It remembered the crimes committed millions of years earlier. Whether the flood truly represented Precursor vengeance remains one of Halo's enduring mysteries. Yet many who encountered Gravemind's reported conversations filled with references to ancient history, judgment, and retribution. The parasite appeared obsessed with the Forerunners' past. The implications were terrifying. The war was not merely about conquest, it was about punishment. As conditions deteriorated, the Halo array moved steadily toward completion. Ring after ring emerged from builder facilities. Testing continued. Logistics expanded. Strategic planning shifted from theoretical discussions to practical implementation. For years, many had comforted themselves with the belief that the rings would never be needed. That illusion was fading. The military situation worsened almost monthly. Entire sectors vanished. Communication networks collapsed. Refugee populations overwhelmed safe regions. Even worlds deep within Forerunner territory began experiencing direct threats. The galaxy was shrinking. Safe places became rare. Hope became rarer. The final years of the Ecumene were defined by this growing awareness. Every major figure understood the stakes. The Librarian raced to preserve life. The Didact raced to save civilization. Builder leadership raced to complete the arrays. All of them were running out of time. The terrible truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The Halo array was no longer a contingency. It was becoming the plan. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the last defensive lines, the flood continued advancing toward the heart of Forerunner civilization. The final chapter of the Ecumene was approaching. Soon, the Forerunners would be forced to decide whether the survival of the future justified the destruction of the present.